show you how to stencil with more than one color. So I'm going to make this 18th century stencil of a flower, and here's the things you're going to need. It's important when choosing something to make your stencil out of that you choose something that your paint isn't going to bleed through. I chose thick art paper, but you could use acetate or vinyl if you were going to be printing yardage. So I picked a stencil that was already the right size for my project, and so I'm just going to cut it out. So now I'm going to cut out my stencil so that I have the whole thing as a stencil, so I can choose which areas I'm going to make each different color. And I'm just going to use an X-Acto knife because it's easier, in my opinion, to do fine detail with something that holds like a pen. So now I'm going to go ahead and use a hole punch to punch out the circles of the little flower buds below the flower, because I think it's easier to get that perfectly round shape with a punch rather than trying to cut it out by hand. Alright, so now I'm going to go back and clean up any little details that still need to be worked out. Like after the punch, these little fine lines are pretty hard, but you want to go back and make sure they're as accurate as possible because it's going to make it so much easier later. So now I'm going to lay out where the stencil is on the stencil paper itself. So I'm lining it up with an edge because it's always nice if you're working with something to make sure that it's square to the edges of your stencil. It makes it easier to lay out when you're doing yardage. And it's important to tape down your stencil so that it doesn't move on you while you're trying to trace it onto the thing you're going to make the stencil out of. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to trace out the corners. So these are registration marks. And that is what is going to help us line up the stencil when we do the second color. So the registration marks want to be the same on every stencil that you use in succession so that all the colors line up in the order and the placement that you intend them to be. And I'm just going to cut off a little bit excess paper that was on the other side just to make it more symmetrical. And now I'm going through the stencil and I'm tracing out all the areas that should be pink. So all the flower parts. Alright, so now I'm going to lift my piece of paper off so that I can see what's underneath and make sure that I drew everything that I needed to draw on that stencil. It looks pretty good. Okay, so now for the green parts. I'm going to do the same thing, measure out my sides, and then I'm going to trace all of the parts that should be green on this stencil. And don't forget your registration marks. So now I'm going to go ahead and cut out my registration marks. The important part that stays the same on your registration marks is the inside of those triangles, because the more precise that line is, the easier it's going to be to line up all four corners when you go to place the second stencil and do the next color. And now I'm just going to go through the rest of the stencil and cut everything out. remember it's important to clean up all the little edges on your stencil, because the sharper that your edges are, the clearer your prints are going to be. So for the second stencil, I'm going to put the first stencil on top and I'm going to line it up with registration marks. And then I'm going to draw through the little lines below the flower that should be green to make sure that they line up with the flower buds that are more like dots. And this is a nice way to go ahead and check to make sure that your two stencils are truly matched up to each other. The important thing to remember, though, is that I'm not going to cut out those little stems out of the stencil that I intend to paint with pink, because I only want the green to come through on those lines. So now I'm going to punch out the little pink buds, and I'm using a punch tool. So now I'm going to go back and cut out the rest with my X-Acto blade. Time to print. The most important thing is to remember to put some plastic down on your table and then lay your work on top of that, so that there's something protecting your work surface from the paint that could go through the fabric. First thing that I'm going to do is put some masking tape underneath each of the registration corners, under those marks, so that I can mark out the registration marks without putting marks on the fabric. Next, I'm going to tape down my stencil so it doesn't move while I'm printing. So now I'm going to double check that my registration marks have tape underneath them, and then mark them out with a Sharpie. Now I'm going to put some paint on my sponge, and I'm just dipping my sponge into the paint, and then I want to make sure that I don't have big glops around the edge, so that looks like a nice even layer of paint, and I'm not going to get any big chunks. And I'm just using a fluid motion on and off so that I get full coverage over the stencil. And then sometimes you really need to get into the little areas and make sure that you're going over them a couple times to make sure the paint has really gone into the small parts of the design. So now we're going to lay down our second stencil on top of the other one, making sure that we're lining up the registration marks. And I'm going to tape it down so that this stencil doesn't go anywhere. And I'm going to go in with the pink. One thing to think about too, if you're doing multiple colors, you may want to give your fabric a little time to dry in between each color so that you don't get smudges from the wet paint underneath interacting with your second stencil. Beautiful. All set. I can't wait to see the work that you do.